Hey guys, Luke here today with a tutorial on how to put DINs on a battery. It's pretty much the same for the guns, it's just you use a male connector instead of a female connector. But there is some difference between doing on batteries and there's some difference on doing on guns. Guns is a little bit harder as it's on the gun and you have this big thing in your counter and you have to try and work with such a small space. But with a battery you can move it around and you have the freedom to do it. So that's why I chose to do the tutorial on the battery, as it's much easier to show you guys on how to do it. Now the first thing you need to put DINs on a battery is a soldering iron, which is this here, which is very dangerous and can be very dangerous for the simple reason as it can burn your hand, you can set shit on fire. It gets really hot that's why the solder melts, and that's why it melts so quick, because it gets so hot and it'll just burn straight through your skin. So now when you're using it, do not touch any of the metal parts whatsoever. Also, I've seen a lot of videos on YouTube and they show them putting DINs on the battery, but they don't show maintaining the actual soldering iron, which is what you need to do as well. Also, you don't want bad solder going onto your connections either. So to keep this maintained, all you need is a small sponge. Now I got this with the soldering iron itself. It's basically a small sponge, and you have to put water in the sponge. And basically what you do, you put like a tiny bit of solder on the soldering iron. I don't know if this is heated up. Yeah. See it up there. You just dab it in the sponge. You do that before you use it and after you use it, and in between putting on connections, just to make sure that there's no bad solder on the tip of it, because if you put bad solder it's not good for the connections. Now that's the simple. So first thing to do when putting things on the batteries is obviously cut the wires. But when you're cutting the wires, you're not cutting them both together, because as say if you're cutting with a metal scissors or pliers, depends what you're using, the current will flow through the scissors and hit the other connection, which is bad for the battery. Could also damage your battery, which you don't want to be doing. So basically just do one at a time. So like that, and then like the other one, like so, and then you have your battery cut off there, and then you have your tamale. You can either chuck these or you can keep these. I keep these to make adapters. Say if I have a DINs gun or DINs battery, I can use this as an adapter. If I don't want to change the battery, or if I have a new gun which I don't want to change it, if I don't like it, if I want to give it back, etc, etc. Now that's just for adapters and not that much of a use. Now first thing you need to do is you need to make sure the wires are spread far apart so they don't be touching off each other. And what you don't want to do is strip them and then thin them. Now thin is basically just put a bit of solder on the wires itself, so it's a solid connection, and make sure they're all connected together. I'll show you that right now. I'm going to zoom in while doing this. So I'm just going to strip the red wire first, and I'm going to thin it. I'm going to do this off camera because I can't really do it on the counter, as I need it in my hands. So you can see there, the battery has been stripped, taking the plastic coating off it. When you do this, you see loads of small little wires, and the reason that's the reason why we need to tin it, is to make sure they're all connected together, and make sure when it's connected to the DINs it doesn't snap off near the end of it, because these wires do break because they're not that strong. That's why they have the protective casing on it. Now what I like to twist the wires so they're nice and tight together, and then put a dab of solder on the soldering iron, like so. And then as I'm heating up solder, I just keep adding it on the way. Let's flip the battery over, do the other side. Like so. Now, you know, as I said, just dabbing the sponge in between solders. Make sure there's no bad solder on your connection. Now, once that's done, that's all good. Now, another thing that you will probably get with your Dean's connections is heat shrink. Now, this is heat shrink right here. Basically, what this is, this covers the connections to make sure there's no metal pieces touching off it and making connection or conductivity to the battery itself. You can use these, or you can use electric tape. Electric tape just does as good a job. It just isn't as neat, and sometimes it comes off as it's not as strong. But that's that. Yeah, so do your 2 wires. That's your red wire done. We'll just do your red wire. Now, I don't usually take much off the wires. I try to keep the wire short as possible, but it depends on what platform you have. If you need long wires, you will need long wires, so try to keep it as long as possible. But in my case, I don't need to have I need to have short wires to have it nice and neat tucked in, so the battery will fit, and so it's nice and neat in the gun. I don't have to put that much hassle into putting into the actual gun itself. Now, my hands might be in the way here. I do apologise. All I'm doing is tin the wires again on the negative wire. Now, to note, doing this, black is negative, red is positive. If you don't know if the wires are that clear stuff, they usually have some kind of markings on them, like little straight black lines. Usually that means it's positive. Yeah, I think it's positive. Unless it has little pluses on it, and the other one has minuses, you'll know which is which. Plus obviously being positive and minus being negative. Yeah, that's that. So I've seen people, they have these fancy fucking holders for holding the Deans, but I wasn't gonna go and buy one for that simple task, because I basically can just get pliers. I usually have an elastic band, but I haven't got it at this point in time, and just clamp the Deans together and then solder the connections on. So first thing you want to do first, before you actually connect the connectors, the wires itself, you want to put a bit of solder on the Dean's connection itself. Now, these usually have markings on them. I don't know if you can see. Probably. But generally the wider part of the Deans, which is this side, is the positive side. As you can see, the top part there is a bit wider than the bottom part, so that means that's the positive, if there's no markings on them. Generally they do have markings on them, because you kind of need to know which is which, so you don't be getting confused. So you just put it in the pliers, or wherever you have to hold it in place. If you're lucky enough to have a fancy clip holder, you can use your fancy clip holder, but all I have is a pliers. There's a bit of solder on that, and then basically just do the negative connection part. Now, while doing this, make sure you don't put too much pressure on the Dean's connection, as there is a lot of heat here and does tend to melt the plastic, and that is not good for the plastic. Right, so there you have your little connections. Now I'm going to do the positive wire first, and as you can see here I have my little heat shrink, and as you can see it's a bit too long and I don't want too much because I don't want to waste it. Basically what you can do is just cut it to the length you have, or if you have heat shrink and it's in a long wire, you just cut it with wire. Basically that's twice the size I need, so I just stick it on like that. Now, while you're doing this, make sure to remember to put on the heat shrink before you solder the connections. I've done this multiple times and had to desolder and put put the heat shrink on and then resolder it again, which is not good and it's very annoying. And yeah, I could have just put electric tape on it, but that's just, I didn't want to do. I want to have a nice clean solid connection. So once you have your heat shrink on and you have your solder on I'll just move it more to the frame, sorry about that. You can just work away. Now generally you want to put a bit solder on the tip, so make sure it's melting the solder quick enough so it will put the connection together. Now people say should be adding solder while doing this. I don't really add solder while I'm doing it because I put solder on the connection and the ends itself, so therefore I don't need to do it. Now, also while doing this, the heat shrink can shrink while on the wire if it's really close to the connection, and the wires do tend to heat up because it does get very hot. Generally blowing on the connection itself coolings it faster, so you can put the heat shrink on. So I have the heat shrink on there, and basically you add heat to shrink it, which is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to do the negative wire. Oh, see, I nearly forgot there. Put the heat shrink on. And you just stick it on like so. Put it in your pliers. And then put the connections on. Now I'm just going to have to cut this back a tiny bit because it's a tiny bit too long. Just make it easier to solder it on. Now just, dab it in your sponge as you do. And then add a bit of salt to the solder iron. Like so. There is fumes coming off this, if you can see them in the camera. They are not toxic, but they do make you cough a tiny bit. If you don't want to be coughing, do this in a well ventilated area, which I don't mind because I'll be only doing it for a couple of seconds. There's that connection done there. So there's your connection done on the ends. Pretty straightforward, not too hard to do. Don't leave your solder iron on whatsoever, knock it off when you're finished with it. It's pretty straightforward. Just when you're putting on the heat shrink, make sure the connection is cooled, because it will start to shrink while you're putting on and only going halfway, and then you won't have heat shrink on your connection at all. You can get different size heat shrink. This heat shrink is considerably small. I have a proper lighter, big deal. There we go. Basically any kind of heat source will shrink it, hairdryer, whatsoever. Be careful when you're doing that, don't have the flame too close because it does burn the heat shrink down a bit. So that's your tutorial on how to change your battery to the ends or your gun. Just had to have that extra step in cutting the wires, which is not that big of a deal. So guys, hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and until next time, adios.